The silence of dawn always felt different in that house. It wasn't peaceful. It was expectant, like the moment before a storm breaks. I sat at the kitchen table, my coffee growing cold in the ceramic mug Evelyn had given me years ago for Father's Day. The one with the faded letters that spelled out "World's Best Dad" in cheerful blue script that now seemed to mock me. My phone lay face up on the scratched wooden surface, its screen casting a pale glow in the dim morning light. The message had been sitting there for 3 hours now, unopened but somehow radiating presence like a stone thrown into still water. Just checking in. How are you holding up? The preview text was enough to send my heart into that familiar, irregular rhythm I'd been trying to ignore for months. Julian Reeves. Even seeing his name in my notifications felt like stepping into a room I'd locked away decades ago. I could hear Evelyn moving around upstairs, the gentle creak of floorboards as she went through her morning routine, shower, hair dryer, the careful selection of another day's armor from her organized closet. She would be down in 20 minutes, asking about my plans for Saturday, reminding me about Simon's call scheduled for this evening, mentioning the grocery list magnet to the refrigerator. The same conversations we'd been having for 23 years of marriage, comfortable and suffocating in equal measure. I touched the screen and watched it illuminate fully. 3 different drafts sat in my message history, each one typed and deleted in the span of sleepless hours. The first had been formal, almost cold. "I'm doing well, thank you. Hope you are too." The second attempt felt forced and cheerful. "Hey Julian, things are good here, just the usual routine. Thanks for asking." The third draft had been honest, maybe too honest. Some days are harder than others, but I suppose that's true for everyone at our age. None of them captured what I actually wanted to say, which was something I couldn't even name. That his message had arrived on a morning when I'd been sitting in this kitchen since 4 a.m., staring at family photos on the refrigerator and feeling like a stranger in my own life. That hearing from him felt like someone had reached through time itself to touch a part of me I'd convinced myself was gone forever. The complicated history Julian had mentioned lived in the spaces between what we'd never said to each other. College roommates for 2 years, we'd shared late nights arguing about literature and philosophy, our conversations sharp with the kind of intellectual combat that young men mistake for animosity. I'd thought he found me irritating, too earnest, too willing to bend toward other people's expectations. He'd seemed to see right through the careful persona I'd built, and I'd interpreted his piercing attention as judgment rather than something else entirely. There had been moments, though, brief instances when the verbal sparring would pause and something quieter would settle between us. The night he'd helped me study for organic chemistry, sitting so close I could smell his soap and the faint scent of the cigarettes he thought no one knew he smoked. The afternoon we'd gotten caught in a rainstorm walking back from the library, both of us soaked and laughing in a way that felt private, sacred even. I'd pushed those memories down so deep, I'd almost convinced myself they were fiction. But Julian's name on my phone screen brought it all rushing back with uncomfortable clarity. The way he'd look at me sometimes across our shared dorm room, like he was waiting for me to understand something I was too afraid or too naive to grasp. The tension that had followed us through our junior year until we'd stopped speaking altogether, a silence that felt more like running away than growing apart. Now, 25 years later, he was asking how I was holding up, as if he could see across all those decades and miles to this kitchen table, to this moment when I felt more lost than I had since I was 20 years old and trying to figure out who I was supposed to become. I picked up the phone, then set it down again. The morning light was strengthening now, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor that Evelyn had chosen because it was practical and easy to clean. Everything in our house had been chosen for practical reasons, including, if I was honest with myself, our marriage. Upstairs, the hairdryer stopped. In a few minutes, she would come down, kiss my cheek with the same gentle affection she'd shown me for years, and we would begin another day of the life we'd built together. A good life, a safe life, a life that felt, in this quiet morning light, like it belonged to someone else entirely. Julian's message waited, patient and persistent as memory itself. The sound of Evelyn's footsteps on the stairs pulled me back to the present, back to the careful choreography of our morning routine. She appeared in the doorway wearing the navy dress she saved for Saturdays, her graying hair pinned back in the same style she'd worn since our wedding day. There was something both comforting and heartbreaking about her consistency. The way she moved through our shared space with the confidence of someone who had never questioned her place in it. "Good morning," she said, pressing her lips to my temple in a kiss that had become as automatic as breathing. I could smell her moisturizer, the same brand she'd used for decades, and beneath it the faint scent of the lavender sachets she tucked into her dresser drawers. "Did you sleep?" she asked, though we both knew the answer. My insomnia had become as much a part of our household rhythm as the coffee maker's morning gurgle and the newspaper delivery at 6:15. I teach at Lincoln High School, a brick building that squats at the edge of town like a monument to modest expectations. For 18 years, I've stood in front of teenagers and tried to convince them that literature matters, that the words of dead poets and long-gone novelists might somehow illuminate their own lives. Most days, I'm not sure I believe it myself. But teaching gives shape to my days, provides the structure that keeps me from drifting entirely into the gray space I sometimes feel pulling at me. My classroom is on the second floor, overlooking the parking lot, where faculty cars sit in neat rows like sleeping animals. I arrive early most mornings, before the building fills with the chaos of adolescent energy, and I stay late, long after the buses have carried their cargo of restless youth back to their suburban homes. In those quiet hours, grading essays about dreams and disappointments, I sometimes catch glimpses of the person I thought I'd become. The passionate educator who would inspire young minds, who would make a difference in ways that mattered. Instead, I've become competent, reliable, safe. Evelyn works part-time at the county library, cataloging returns and helping elderly patrons navigate the computer system. We married young, right after college, driven by a combination of genuine affection and the expectations that seemed to surround us like invisible walls. She was studying education then, planning to teach elementary school, but after Simon was born she stayed home, and by the time she was ready to return to work, the classroom had moved on without her. She never complained about this, never expressed regret, but sometimes I catch her looking at the teaching magazines that still arrive in our mailbox, addressed to a version of herself that never quite materialized. Our children have grown up in this house, in this life we built with such careful intention. Simon is 20, a junior at the state university studying business because it seemed practical, because it promised stability. He calls every Sunday evening at 7. Our conversations following the same gentle pattern of questions about classes and friends and plans for the future. He's a good son, dutiful and kind, but I sometimes wonder if he inherited my capacity for building a life that looks right from the outside while feeling hollow at its center. Nora is 18, a senior counting down her final months before college. She moves through our house like a ghost preparing to haunt somewhere else, already half gone even as she sits at our dinner table pushing food around her plate. She's applied to schools on both coasts, as far from here as financial aid will allow, and I don't blame her. This town, this life, it's not built for dreamers. It's built for people who learn to find contentment in routine, who discover meaning in small responsibilities and quiet satisfactions. Our evenings follow patterns worn smooth by repetition. Dinner at 6:30, the television news playing softly while we discuss our days in the careful shorthand of long marriage. Evelyn mentions Mrs. Patterson's questions about the book club selection or the new display she's planning for the library's local history section. I talk about lesson plans and parent conferences, about Tommy Henderson's improving essay structure or Sarah Kim's insightful analysis of The Great Gatsby. Normal conversations in a normal life. Each word a small brick in the wall that keeps us safe and separate from anything that might disturb our careful equilibrium. But lately, something has shifted in the spaces between these conversations. I find myself lingering at my desk after Evelyn has gone to bed, ostensibly grading papers, but really just sitting in the quiet, feeling the weight of years settling around my shoulders like dust. In the bottom drawer of my desk, beneath gradebooks and old lesson plans, there's a shoebox filled with letters I've written but never sent. Letters to former students, to college friends who've scattered across the country, to versions of myself I can barely remember being. The letters pile up like evidence of a life unlived, thoughts and feelings with nowhere to go. Sometimes, in those late hours, I walk through our house and feel like an intruder in my own life. The family photos that line the hallway tell the story of graduations and birthdays, vacations to predictable destinations, Christmases that blur together in a haze of wrapping paper and forced joy. In every picture, I'm smiling the same careful smile, the one that says everything is exactly as it should be. But behind that smile, behind the man who mows the lawn on Saturday mornings and attends parent-teacher conferences and writes grocery lists in neat handwriting, there's someone else. Someone I've spent decades learning not to acknowledge. The person Julian's message had awakened was that hidden self, the one who remembers what it felt like to want something desperately, to argue passionately about ideas that mattered, to lie awake at night thinking about another person with an intensity that scared and thrilled him in equal measure. That version of me had been buried so deep under layers of responsibility and respectability that I'd almost convinced myself he'd never existed at all. But Julian's name on my phone screen was like a key turning in a lock I'd forgotten I'd built. The email arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, buried between promotional messages and administrative updates from the school district. Alumni Relations Committee, the subject line read, followed by words that made my chest tighten. 25th reunion. Don't miss this milestone. I almost deleted it without opening. The same reflexive dismissal I'd given to similar invitations over the years. College felt like something that had happened to someone else, a chapter I'd closed so definitively that even thinking about it required effort. But I opened it anyway, perhaps because Julian's message was still glowing unread on my phone, perhaps because something in me was tired of reflexive dismissals. The email was cheerfully impersonal, filled with exclamation points and reunion committee enthusiasm. Save the date. Reconnect with old friends. Relive the best years of your life. The language felt foreign, as if written in a dialect I'd once spoken fluently, but could no longer quite understand. There was a list of confirmed attendees, names arranged alphabetically like a roll call from memory. I scrolled through them with growing unease, recognizing faces from a time when I'd been someone else entirely. David Chun, my organic chemistry lab partner. Sarah Williams, who'd lived down the hall from us sophomore year. Michael Torres, who'd been student body president and had probably become exactly the kind of success story reunion committees love to showcase. And there, near the bottom, Julian Reeves, class of 1999. My finger hovered over his name like it might burn me. Of course he'd be going. Julian had always been the type to face things head-on, to walk directly into situations that made other people uncomfortable. It was one of the qualities I'd admired and resented about him in equal measure. While I'd spent college learning to smooth my edges, to become the kind of person who fit easily into other people's expectations, Julian had remained stubbornly himself, sharp and uncompromising, and somehow magnetic because of it. I closed the laptop and went downstairs to start dinner, but the reunion invitation sat in my mind like a pebble in my shoe. Over the next few days, I found myself returning to it, reading through the details and looking at the photos they'd posted from previous reunions. Groups of middle-aged people wearing name tags and nostalgic smiles, holding drinks and trying to bridge the gap between who they'd been and who they'd become. It was during one of these late-night browsing sessions that my phone buzzed with a text from Julian. Nothing elaborate, just a simple message that cut through the accumulated years like a blade. Saw the reunion email. You thinking about going? I stared at the message for a long time before responding. The careful politeness of my reply felt like armor. I hadn't decided yet. Are you planning to attend? His response came quickly, probably. It's been too long since I've seen everyone. Everyone. The word carried weight, implications I wasn't ready to examine too closely. Did everyone include me? Had Julian thought about me over the years the way I tried not to think about him? The questions felt dangerous, like picking at a wound that had never quite healed properly. Our texting conversation continued over the following days, cautious at first, like two people testing the ice on a frozen lake. We talked about work. Julian had become a social worker in Portland, Oregon, helping kids in the foster system. We talked about our families in general terms. We talked about books, the way we used to, though now our references were to middle-aged concerns rather than the urgent philosophical questions that had kept us up until dawn in college. But gradually, something shifted in our exchanges. The messages grew longer, more personal. Julian mentioned that he'd never married, that he'd come close a few times, but it had never felt quite right. I found myself typing and deleting responses, unsure how to navigate the minefield of his admission. When I finally replied, I kept it safe. Marriage isn't for everyone. Some people are better suited to independence. His response came hours later. I don't think it was about independence. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I changed the subject. But his words lingered, joining the growing collection of things I couldn't quite process, couldn't quite dismiss. As our correspondence deepened, memories began surfacing with uncomfortable clarity. Late nights in our dorm room when we'd argued about everything from Kerouac's authenticity to the ethics of genetic engineering, our voices growing heated not because we disagreed, but because we cared so much about being understood by each other. The way Julian would pace when he was thinking, running his hands through his dark hair until it stood at odd angles. The night he'd found me crying over a letter from home. My father's disappointment that I'd changed my major from pre-med to English, and had sat beside me on my narrow dorm bed, not saying anything, just being present in a way that had felt more intimate than any conversation. I'd pushed those memories down for reasons I'd never fully examined. At 22, building a life with Evelyn, they'd felt like detours from the path I was supposed to be walking. Now, at 47, they felt like breadcrumbs leading back to a version of myself I'd lost somewhere along the way. The reunion invitation sat on my desk like a door I could choose to open or keep closed. But Julian's messages made that choice feel less abstract, more urgent. In one particularly long exchange about the books that had shaped us, he mentioned The Hours by Michael Cunningham. It's about people trapped by the lives they've built, he wrote. About the courage it takes to admit you might have taken a wrong turn somewhere. I'd read that book years ago, had even taught it to my AP students, but Julian's reference to it felt personal in a way that made my pulse quicken. Was he talking about literature, or was he talking about us? About the reunion, or about something larger? The question I couldn't answer was why Julian's presence in my life felt so necessary now, when for 25 years I'd managed perfectly well without him. But as our conversations continued, I began to understand that I hadn't managed well at all. I'd simply learned to live with a persistent ache I'd convinced myself was normal, the way people learn to live with chronic pain by pretending it doesn't exist. Julian's messages were like physical therapy for a limb I'd forgotten I'd injured. Painful, but in a way that suggested healing might be possible. The reunion was 6 weeks away. 6 weeks to decide whether I had the courage to return to the place where I'd first learned who I really was, before I'd learned to hide that person so completely that even I sometimes forgot he existed. 6 weeks to decide if I was brave enough to see Julian again, knowing that everything I'd built in the years since college might not survive the encounter. The first time Julian called, I almost didn't answer. His name appeared on my phone screen during the dinner hour, while Evelyn was serving pot roast and Nora was complaining about her college application essays. For a moment, I stared at the device as if it were something foreign, dangerous. Then I excused myself and stepped onto the back porch, my finger trembling slightly as I accepted the call. His voice was deeper than I remembered, weathered by years and cigarettes he'd probably never quit, but it carried the same intensity that had once made ordinary conversations feel like urgent negotiations. We started tentatively, the way people do when they're unsure of their footing. He talked about Portland's rain, the challenges of his work with foster children. I mentioned the usual complaints about budget cuts and standardized testing. Safe topics, neutral ground. But then he said something that cut through all the careful politeness. I've been thinking about that argument we had about Salinger. You said Holden Calden was just privileged self-pity, and I spent 3 hours trying to prove you wrong. Do you remember? I remembered. It had been late October of our sophomore year, leaves turning outside our dorm window, both of us exhausted from midterms, but too wired to sleep. Julian had been passionate in his defense of The Catcher in the Rye, insisting that Holden's alienation was genuine, that his rejection of phoniness was a form of moral clarity. I'd argued the opposite, that adolescent angst was a luxury only available to those who didn't have to worry about real problems. We'd gone back and forth until nearly dawn, neither of us willing to concede, both of us secretly thrilled by the intensity of the exchange. You made me think about privilege in ways I hadn't before, Julian said now, his voice carrying across 25 years with startling clarity. I wasn't ready to admit it then, but you were probably right about Holden. And maybe about me too. The vulnerability in his admission caught me off guard. The Julian I remembered had been proud, sometimes arrogant, unwilling to show weakness. This version of him, mellowed by time and experience, felt both familiar and completely new. We talked for 2 hours that first night, long past the point when I should have gone inside to help with dishes and homework supervision. When I finally hung up, Evelyn was already in bed, reading with the careful attention she gave to books she didn't quite enjoy but felt she should finish. After that, our phone calls became a regular occurrence. Every few nights, sometimes more often, Julian's name would light up my screen, and I'd find an excuse to slip away from the routines of family life. We'd talk about books we were reading, movies we'd seen, the small frustrations and unexpected joys of middle age. But underneath these ordinary topics ran something deeper, a current I could feel but couldn't name. Julian had a way of asking questions that made me examine my own assumptions. When I mentioned feeling burned out on teaching, he didn't offer the usual platitudes about noble professions and making a difference. Instead, he asked what I'd wanted to be when I was 18, before practicality and other people's expectations had narrowed my choices. When I complained about the bureaucracy of public education, he wondered aloud whether I'd ever considered writing, remembering essays I'd written in college that he said had stayed with him for years. These conversations began to change something in me, like water slowly reshaping stone. I started looking forward to Julian's calls with an anticipation that felt almost adolescent in its intensity. During faculty meetings or parent conferences, I'd find myself composing things to tell him later, crafting observations and stories I thought might make him laugh or provoke one of his thoughtful responses. The phone would ring at 9 or 10 in the evening, and my pulse would quicken before I even looked at the screen. Evelyn began to notice my distraction. She'd ask who was calling so frequently, and I'd mention an old college friend without elaborating. She'd nod and return to her book or her crossword puzzle, but I could feel her watchfulness, the way she'd glance up when I excused myself to take Julian's calls. There was nothing accusatory in her attention, just a quiet awareness that something in our carefully balanced household had shifted. The change wasn't just in my behavior, but in how I felt inside my own skin. For years, I'd moved through my days with the efficiency of someone following a well-worn path, each day blending into the next in a comfortable haze of routine. But Julian's presence in my life, even at a distance, brought back a sharpness I'd forgotten I possessed. Colors seemed more vivid, conversations more meaningful, my own thoughts more worth examining. During our longer calls, when Julian would share stories from his work or memories from his 20s, I'd find myself studying his voice for clues about the person he'd become. There was a gentleness there that I didn't remember from college, a patience that suggested he'd learned things about himself and the world that had softened his harder edges. The man who'd once argued with fierce intensity about abstract principles now spoke with quiet compassion about the children in his care, about systemic failures and small victories. But sometimes, in unguarded moments, I'd catch glimpses of the old Julian. The way he'd pause before responding to something I'd said, as if he were choosing his words more carefully than the conversation required. The slight change in his tone when he'd ask about my family, a careful neutrality that felt loaded with unspoken questions. These moments made me wonder what he was thinking, what he wasn't saying, and whether the undercurrent I felt between us existed only in my imagination. One evening, about 3 weeks into our renewed correspondence, Julian called later than usual. It was past 11, and the house was quiet except for the familiar sounds of settling wood and distant traffic. Evelyn had been asleep for an hour, and I was grading essays in my study when the phone buzzed. "I couldn't sleep," Julian said when I answered. "I keep thinking about things I should have said differently back then. Opportunities one missed." There was something in his voice I couldn't identify, a rawness that made me set down my red pen and give him my full attention. We talked for 3 hours that night, moving gradually from general reminiscences to more personal territory. He told me about relationships that hadn't worked out, about feeling like he'd spent years trying to become someone he thought he should be instead of accepting who he actually was. I found myself sharing things I'd never told anyone. The loneliness I sometimes felt despite being surrounded by family. The sense that I was living someone else's life by accident rather than choice. As the conversation deepened, I became aware of how carefully we were both navigating around something. Every personal revelation was followed by a slight retreat, as if we were both afraid of getting too close to whatever lay at the center of our renewed connection. But the very fact that we were being careful suggested there was something there worth being careful about. When I finally hung up that night, dawn was already touching the edges of the sky. I sat in my study for a long time afterward, feeling like someone who'd been holding his breath for decades and had finally remembered how to exhale. Something was happening to me, something I couldn't control or fully understand. Julian was becoming necessary in a way that both thrilled and terrified me. The reunion was 3 weeks away, and with each passing day, the question of whether to attend felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability. I almost turned around 3 times on the drive to campus. Each mile felt like traveling backward through my own life, past the strip malls and subdivisions that had grown up around the university like scar tissue, past the familiar landmarks that triggered memories I'd spent decades learning to ignore. The registration table was set up in the student union, the same building where Julian and I had spent countless hours arguing about literature and life, though it had been renovated beyond recognition. The woman behind the table smiled with the aggressive friendliness of volunteer labor as she handed me a name tag that read "Hello, my name is Malcolm" in cheerful red letters, as if I might have forgotten who I was supposed to be. The reception was already in full swing when I walked into the ballroom, the air thick with competing perfumes and the forced enthusiasm of people trying to bridge 25 years in the span of an evening. I recognized faces immediately, despite the gray hair and laugh lines and the subtle ways time had softened or hardened familiar features. David Chun was talking animatedly near the bar, gesturing with the same energy he'd once brought to organic chemistry lab. Sarah Williams stood in a circle of women I remembered from our dorm, all of them holding wine glasses and speaking with the careful politeness of people performing friendship for an audience. But I was looking for Julian, scanning the room with the nervous attention of someone searching for a ghost. When I finally saw him, standing alone near the windows overlooking the quad, my breath caught in my throat. He was older, grayer around the temples, but he carried himself with the same quiet intensity that had always set him apart from our classmates. He wore a dark blue shirt that made his eyes look almost black, and when our gazes met across the crowded room, I felt something shift inside my chest like a door opening. He didn't smile, exactly, but something in his expression softened as I made my way toward him. The conversations around us faded into background noise, the way they had during our late-night discussions in college when the rest of the world seemed to disappear. "You came," he said when I reached him, and there was something in his voice, relief, maybe, or surprise, that made me wonder how uncertain he'd been about seeing me again. We talked carefully at first, the way people do when they're not sure of their footing. He asked about my family, I asked about his work. We commented on the changes to the campus, the way our old dormitory had been torn down and replaced with something sleeker and less personal. Safe topics, familiar territory, but underneath it all ran the same current I'd been feeling during our phone calls, stronger now that we were in the same room, breathing the same air. As the evening wore on, the reception began to thin out. Groups of classmates drifted away to continue their reunions at local bars or hotel lounges. But Julian and I remained by the windows, our conversation growing deeper as the crowd around us diminished. We talked about the books that had shaped us, the teachers who'd challenged our assumptions, the moments in college when we'd felt like we were becoming the people we were meant to be. But there was something else happening, something neither of us was naming directly. The way Julian would pause before responding to certain questions, as if he were editing himself in real time. The way my pulse would quicken when he'd lean closer to hear me over the music. The careful distance we maintained between our bodies, as if we were both aware of some invisible boundary we weren't sure we were allowed to cross. The revelation came when we stepped outside for air, onto the terrace that overlooked the quad where we'd walked together so many times as students. The night was warm, humid in the way that made memories feel more vivid, more immediate. We stood at the railing in comfortable silence, watching late students cross the paths below us like actors in a play we'd once been part of. "I need to tell you something," Julian said suddenly, his voice so quiet I had to lean closer to hear him. "About college. About why things ended the way they did between us." I waited, my heart beating so hard I was sure he could hear it. The silence stretched between us like a held breath. "I didn't hate you," he said finally. "I know it seemed like I did, especially that last semester. All that anger, all those arguments that never seemed to be about what we were actually arguing about. But it wasn't hate, Malcolm. It was the opposite." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with implications I was afraid to examine too closely. Julian was staring out at the quad, his hands gripped tightly around the railing, and I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he was holding himself like someone preparing for impact. "I was 20 years old," he continued, "and I didn't have words for what I was feeling. Every time you'd bring some girl back to the room, every time you'd talk about your future plans with Evelyn, it felt like drowning. I thought if I could make you angry enough, if I could push you away completely, it would hurt less." My throat felt tight, like I was breathing through cotton. All those fights that had seemed so pointless, so destructive, they'd been Julian's way of protecting himself from feelings he couldn't name or accept. And I'd interpreted his intensity as rejection, his passion as hostility, never understanding that I'd been the source of both. "I was afraid," he said, turning to look at me finally. "Afraid of what it meant, what people would think, what you would think. It was easier to let you believe I couldn't stand you than to risk telling you the truth." The truth. The words settled between us like something precious and fragile. I thought about all the years I'd spent convinced that Julian had found me lacking, irritating, somehow fundamentally disappointing. How wrong I'd been about everything. "Julian," I started to say, but he wasn't finished. "I've spent 25 years wondering what would have happened if I'd been braver. If I told you how I felt instead of hiding behind all that anger. And now, talking to you again, I can't help but think we both lost something important." The silence that followed was different from all the silences we'd shared over the years. This one was full rather than empty, charged with recognition and possibility. When Julian reached out and placed his hand on my arm, the touch sent electricity through my entire body. It wasn't a kiss, wasn't even particularly intimate by conventional standards, but it carried more weight than any physical contact I'd experienced in years. His hand was warm against my skin, and I could feel the slight tremor in his fingers that suggested he was as affected by this moment as I was. We stood there like that for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, both of us finally understanding what had been between us all along, what we'd been too young and afraid to acknowledge. In that moment, I realized that Julian hadn't been the only one carrying a secret ache all these years. The emptiness I'd felt, the sense of living someone else's life, the quiet desperation that had been my constant companion, it all made sense now. I'd been mourning something I'd never allowed myself to have, grieving a possibility I'd buried so deep I'd forgotten it existed. The realization was both terrifying and liberating, like stepping off a cliff and discovering you could fly. The drive home from the reunion felt like traveling through a different universe than the one I'd inhabited that morning. Everything looked the same. The familiar streets, The houses where neighbors I'd known for decades were sleeping peacefully, but I felt fundamentally altered, as if Julian's touch had awakened something that could never be put back to sleep. Evelyn was reading in bed when I got home, wearing the same blue nightgown she'd had for years, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. She looked up when I entered our bedroom, and I could see her taking inventory of my face the way she might examine a student's homework for signs of trouble. "How was it?" she asked, setting down her book with the careful attention she gave to moments when she sensed something important was happening. I told her about seeing old classmates, about the changes to campus, about conversations that had felt both familiar and strange. All true, but not the truth. She listened with the patient interest she'd always shown for my stories, nodding in the right places, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated she was really listening. But I could feel her watching me with something more than casual curiosity. The next few days passed in a haze of ordinary routine, made extraordinary by the secret I was carrying. I taught my classes, graded papers, attended department meetings, but underneath it all ran the constant awareness of Julian's words, the memory of his hand on my arm. The weight of 25 years of misunderstanding suddenly lifted. He texted me the day after the reunion, a simple message that carried impossible weight. "Thank you for listening. It meant everything to finally tell you the truth." I found myself rereading that message dozens of times, studying it like a piece of literature that might reveal new meanings with closer analysis. Julian and I began talking again, but our conversations were different now. The careful neutrality was gone, replaced by an honesty that was both thrilling and terrifying. He told me about the relationships he'd tried to build with women, how he'd convinced himself for years that he just hadn't found the right person, when the truth was simpler and more complicated. He'd been looking in the wrong direction entirely. I shared my own version of the same story, though I'd never articulated it even to myself until Julian's revelation had given me permission to examine my own buried feelings. The contentment I'd felt in my marriage, I realized, had always been the contentment of someone who'd learned to find satisfaction in meeting expectations rather than following desires. I'd been a good husband to Evelyn because being good was what I knew how to do, not because marriage to her felt like the natural expression of who I was. Evelyn noticed the change before I fully understood it myself. She began asking more questions about my late-night phone calls, about the distant expression I wore during our dinner conversations. When I'd excuse myself to text Julian back, she'd watch me with the careful attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle she wasn't sure she wanted to complete. The confrontation came on a Thursday evening in late November. I'd been in the kitchen, ostensibly cleaning up after dinner, but really waiting for Julian's nightly call, when Evelyn appeared in the doorway. She stood there for a long moment, studying me with an expression I'd never seen before, part curiosity, part fear, part resignation. "Malcolm," she said finally, her voice carrying the weight of our entire marriage. "We need to talk." I knew before she said another word what conversation we were about to have. Perhaps I'd been waiting for it, dreading it, and longing for it in equal measure. We sat at the kitchen table where I'd first seen Julian's message, where this entire journey had begun, and Evelyn folded her hands in front of her with the composure she brought to difficult parent conferences and medical appointments. "There's someone else, isn't there?" she said. It wasn't really a question. I could have lied. For 23 years, I'd been so practiced at giving Evelyn the answers she needed to hear that dishonesty would have been automatic, effortless. But Julian's courage in telling me the truth had changed something fundamental in me. I couldn't go back to the careful deceptions that had once felt like kindness. "Yes," I said, "but not in the way you think." Her composure cracked slightly, just a tightening around her eyes that suggested she was working harder than usual to maintain control. "Who is it?" she asked. "Julian Reeves. From college." The name clearly meant nothing to her, which somehow made everything worse. This person who had become so central to my emotional life that I could barely remember what it felt like before he'd returned to it, was a complete stranger to the woman I'd spent over 2 decades building a life with. "Are you in love with him?" The question came out steady, matter of fact, as if she were asking about the weather or my plans for the weekend. I don't know, I said, which was honest but inadequate. What I felt for Julian was more complicated than love, more foundational. It was like discovering a part of myself I'd thought was lost forever, like remembering how to breathe after years of holding my breath. Evelyn absorbed this information with the same careful attention she gave to everything that mattered. She asked practical questions. Had I been physically unfaithful? Was I planning to leave? What did this mean for our family? Her voice never rose, never cracked, but I could see the devastation in her eyes, the way she was working to hold herself together while her world reorganized itself around this new reality. The worst part was her lack of surprise. As I talked, explaining about Julian's revelation at the reunion and my own gradual understanding of feelings I'd buried for decades, I realized that some part of Evelyn had always known. She'd seen something in me that I'd hidden even from myself, had perhaps been waiting for this moment without knowing what she was waiting for. How long? She asked when I'd finished explaining. How long have you felt this way? Since college, I admitted. Maybe longer. I just didn't have words for it then. The silence that followed was crushing. 23 years of marriage, 2 children, a lifetime of shared experiences and accumulated intimacy. And it all seemed suddenly fragile, built on foundations that had been cracking for decades without either of us acknowledging the damage. Evelyn stood up finally, her movements careful and deliberate, and I realized she was crying without making any sound. She walked to the window that looked out on our backyard, where the swing set we'd built for Simon and Nora still stood despite our children having outgrown it years ago. I need time to think, she said without turning around. I need you to give me space to figure out what this means. I wanted to comfort her, to apologize, to promise that we could find a way through this that wouldn't destroy everything we'd built together. But the truth was that something had already been destroyed, had been slowly eroding for years without either of us admitting it. Julian's return to my life hadn't created the problem. It had simply illuminated what had always been missing. That night, I slept in the guest room for the first time since Nora had been born, and Evelyn had banished me temporarily for snoring. But this felt different, more permanent. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, thinking about the impossible choice I was facing. The life I'd built with Evelyn, stable and familiar and good in all the ways that mattered, or the terrifying possibility of something genuine and unknown with Julian. Either choice would require me to hurt people I loved. Either choice would mean giving up something precious and irreplaceable. But for the first time in decades, I was facing a choice that was actually mine to make. 2 weeks passed in a strange suspension of normal life. Evelyn and I moved through our house like polite strangers, maintaining the routines that held our family together while everything underneath shifted and settled into new configurations. She made coffee in the morning. I graded papers at the kitchen table. We asked each other about plans for the day with the careful courtesy of people sharing space in a hotel. Nora sensed the change immediately, the way teenagers do when the adult world around them becomes unstable. She asked fewer questions than usual, spent more time in her room, and began talking about college with the urgent enthusiasm of someone planning an escape. Simon called less frequently, perhaps picking up on the tension even through our weekly phone conversations. I found myself envying my children their ability to focus on futures that stretched ahead of them like open roads, while I felt stuck in the space between who I'd been and who I might still become. Julian and I continued to talk, but our conversations were different now, colored by the knowledge that every word carried weight, that we were no longer dealing in hypotheticals. He never pressured me to make a decision, never asked about Evelyn or what I was planning to do. Instead, he simply existed in my life the way he had in college, as a presence that made everything else feel more real, more urgent, more worth examining. The end came quietly, the way important things sometimes do. I woke up one morning to find Evelyn sitting at the kitchen table, already dressed, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had gone cold. She looked up when I entered, and I could see she'd been crying, though her face was composed now, settled into a decision I could read in the set of her shoulders. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice steady in the way that meant she'd rehearsed this conversation in her mind. About us. About what you told me. I sat down across from her. The same seats we'd occupied for thousands of morning conversations over the years, but everything felt different now, charged with the weight of endings. I love you, Malcolm, she said, and the past tense in her voice was gentle but unmistakable. I've loved you for most of my adult life. But I think we both know that what we built together was based on who we thought we were supposed to be, not who we actually are. The truth of this settled between us like something we'd both been avoiding for years. Our marriage had been built on compatibility, shared values, mutual respect, and genuine affection. But it had never been built on the kind of fundamental recognition I'd felt when Julian touched my arm at the reunion, the sense of being seen completely and accepted without reservation. I don't want to be the reason you can't live your truth, Evelyn continued. And I don't want to spend the rest of my life with someone who's pretending to be something he's not, even if he's doing it out of love for me. Her generosity in that moment was almost unbearable. After 23 years of marriage, she was giving me permission to leave, to pursue a possibility that would inevitably hurt her. It would have been easier if she'd been angry, if she'd fought for what we'd built together. Her grace made the choice harder and more necessary at the same time. We talked for hours that morning, about practical things, the house, the children, how we'd explain this shift to the people who'd known us as a couple for decades. But also about deeper things, about the ways we'd both compromised essential parts of ourselves to make our marriage work, about the quiet loneliness that had lived at the center of even our happiest moments together. When Evelyn finally went upstairs to begin the impossible task of untangling two lives that had grown together like vines, I remained at the kitchen table. The morning light slanted through the windows the same way it had on the day Julian's message had first arrived, but everything else had changed. I was no longer the man who had sat here paralyzed by possibility, afraid to respond to an invitation back to life. That evening, I found myself in the same spot, but the silence felt different now. Not expectant or heavy, but spacious, full of potential. On the counter, two wedding rings sat side by side, mine and Evelyn's, removed with ceremony but without bitterness, symbols of a chapter that was ending with as much dignity as we could manage. My phone buzzed against the wooden surface of the table, Julian's name appearing on the screen like a promise. His message was simple, understated in the way that had always characterized his most important communications. Just checking in. No rush. I'm here. For the first time since I'd known him, I didn't hesitate. I picked up the phone and began to type, my fingers moving with certainty across the keyboard. I thought about all the messages I'd drafted and deleted over the years, all the words I'd swallowed because they felt too dangerous, too revealing, too true. This time, I let myself write exactly what I wanted to say. The kitchen filled with the soft glow of the phone screen, casting light on the familiar surfaces that would soon belong to someone else's life. Outside, the suburban streets were quiet, most of our neighbors already settled into their evening routines. But inside this house, in the space between one life and another, something new was beginning. I typed until my message felt complete, then read it over once before hitting send. The words disappeared into the ether, carrying with them decades of silence and the promise of whatever came next. The phone screen dimmed, then went dark, but the feeling remained. The sense of having finally chosen authenticity over safety, truth over convenience, the terrifying freedom of stepping into the unknown with someone who had always seen me clearly, even when I couldn't see myself.